before I get started, I kind of want to share something that's interesting that relates to my topic. I just came from high school that I graduated from to pass out invitation. And one of the faculty told me that she would never see the day that I graduate. And it's a very interesting comment to me, where she, as far as her background and certain things and where I came from. So Allen, according to Allen, on the research, he says humans develop best in surroundings where they are valued, where they feel safe and accepted, when they have social networks. But for African Americans, for the past 21st century, it hasn't been the same. So what happens to African American students when they enter college? When you get to the entry level, when you select your major, through all that time, what happens, what goes on in African American life? And today, the topic at hand is the epidemic of higher education among African Americans and their collegiate success. So the problem we're going to look at today is the low retention and graduation rates amongst African Americans. And nationally, the statistics tell us that there is a 43% graduation rate amongst African Americans compared to whites, which is 63%. So what we're going to investigate is the voices of African Americans. What do African Americans portray? Why is this existing? Why is this gap occurring? And so when I thought about this, I began to kind of investigate what is going on at UD. We talk about predominantly white institutions, is PWI. So you see that term throughout the presentation. So you see PWI, predominantly white institutions. So what does this mean for students? So as right now, we look at the graph here, is the freshman retention rates from 2002 to 2010 is pretty much even, as you can see, but it has a drop. And why are students leaving and not returning? And then another graph I began to look at is the University of Dayton 4-year graduation rate. So when the student comes in 4 years, this is the graduation rate. These are the period, as you can see, is whites, and at the bottom you can see is blacks. So from last year, we had a 31% graduation rate compared to whites, a 62% graduation rate. So why is this gap existing? That's the question we're going to ask today. Why is this gap and what's going on at the University of Dayton, but not just at that, but predominantly white institutions where this gap exists. So we're going to be investigating that. So my research question is, what are the major barriers and obstacles African Americans, that's among African Americans that impacts their collegiate success? So is it that African Americans are not well educated, that they're not succeeding? Is it the academic performance of African Americans and why their graduation rates are so low? It's below the national average. The national average is 43%. It's 31% in institutions such as this. And we talk about an institution like UD that's very great in the community. So we're going to investigate that. So before I do that, I kind of want to introduce you to some of the theories, the theoretical perspective of Joe Fagan. He talks about systemic racism. And one thing he talks about, it involves the policies and practices and procedures of institutions that have a negative effect on racial minorities' access to the quality of goods, resources, and services. So it's not so much just the person, the individual, but it's also the macro level institution, what's going on with the policies and practice. Then he also talks about the systemic practice of racism is built into society institutions. So it's like the restaurants, you know, the media, all these different things portray this dominant group. And so we look at the white, we look at Benilius Silva. He talks about a racialized social system, and what he says in the research is that society is based on, he said that this issue is based on societies that base everything on race. And he said that the interests of the dominant group can take precedence over the minority, which would cause one group to struggle. So the interests of a dominant group can take precedence over the minority group, which would cause that one group to struggle. And we look at these systematic disadvantages, so I began to look at other research, and they talk about this term, structural constraints and institutional barriers that African Americans are facing on predominantly white institutions to persist and into graduating. And some of the things that they talked about is a racial hostile environment. So how can you enter as an African American but face a lot of racial stereotypes? The climate, the sense of belonging that you are not welcome. Also the student and faculty relationships and different things like that. So I wanted to see, are these things really true? Is it that African Americans are not performing well in the classroom, or is it really the structural constraints, the institutional barriers that African Americans are facing that affects the graduation rate that exists so low today. So my methods, I decided to do a survey to get the voices of the students, and I had over 80 respondents, pretty good. But I wanted to focus kind of particularly on the university today because we all familiar with what goes on here, and also just to further more research. And I decided to use SurveyMonkey. So with that, with my 88 respondents, I only used 38 respondents, which were African Americans. It was 12 males and 26 females. And I wanted to examine the everyday experience. So I had various different questions. We're going to go through those questions, and we're going to check it out and see what do African Americans feel about how do they feel by being present on the predominantly white institution. So to look at the demographics, kind of like the social class, like where do these students exist? Because a lot of studies says that African Americans, if they don't have a lot of money or they're in a lower class, it's because they don't succeed. And as we can see here from the respondents, I asked the question, making an educated guess, what social class do you consider your family's socioeconomic status? And as we can see here, majority of the students say working class. So as you look at the area graph here, you have working class about 37%, and you have middle class about 25% there, and then you have below poverty is about 11. So majority of African American students who responded to the survey, majority fits below the middle class. You have about 63 students, which, 9 students says they are above the upper middle class. The next question is, what are the special issues faced by African Americans at your college institution? So I didn't want to assume that these things were true, that the structural constraints that researchers said were true. I wanted to see what else was going on, some other options. So as you can see on the results, I had select all that apply, so it wasn't like they choose just one particular thing. I wanted to see everything, to see capture everything. So from here, from their results from that question, you can see that discrimination is the highest responder, which is 80%. And you have racism and stereotypes, which is 77%, and then you have student-student relationships. So as I began to see these down, I started asking my questions like, really? Like, what's really going on? And as you can see further down, it's not so much the accessibility of resources and support, it's more what's going on in everyday stages of our lives that affects them. So another thing is, so if it's the racism or the discrimination, is it interaction among students or staff? So I asked this question, how often do you have a conversation with other students different from your race, ethnicity, background, when you're not asked? So like when you're not asked in the classroom or whatsoever. But at the same time, we have majority of students present always. So I kind of couldn't really analyze this part, but I'm thinking about you at Predominantly White Institution, majority whites, you in the classroom, you in organizations, you're going to have some type of relationship. So I kind of consider that why. But if we look at the area of majority of students, it's more on this side of the graph, which is not very often, and somewhat often, kind of like, I don't know. So the next question I asked was, what has contributed to your academic success? I wanted to figure out if it's not so much the things that we deal with every day, what else has contributed to your academic success for those who are achieving, who are persisting through this type of issues that they're facing on UD campus or at a predominantly white institution? What contributes the most? Is that, as we can see, we have family support. The options they have with family support, faculty support, academic assistance, financial assistance, and student life. And majority of students said family support. So why do they say family support? And if you think about, if you're on a campus and you're going through hell, like you got to study, you're trying to be in an organization, some may be in relationships, you're dealing with any personal, and you're dealing with institutional barriers such as racial stereotypes and racism, family support is important to cope, to deal with those things. So I kind of see that as why is that the majority of students say that this is so much important. Then they have faculty support. And it's very interesting how important is faculty is to help students get through. So what do you think are the barriers and obstacles to your success? And as you can see here, we said lack of financial assistance is the most, and then we have unwelcoming environment, which is the second most. And then the last question I had is, how welcome do you feel as a student at your institution? And as you can see, it's very moderate. The majority said moderate. A few said very well. and a few said very little. So in just all these different things in closing, what does this all mean? I think this is a question we have to ask just further in our research and saying, if it's not so much what they perform in the classroom, it's not so much the achievements of African American students, how can we fix this issue that's going on outside the classroom so students can persist and continue to graduate at predominantly white institutions? So collegiate success is not just based on, we can't just judge it based on what the student does in the classroom, but what goes on outside the classroom. So institutional change has to take place. And how can we do that? And being accountable to the disassociation of African American students of color, period. So these are some of the questions that I came up with. And one thing I want to share before I close is that in order for us to continue to move forward in a multicultural society, it's important that we can begin to have these conversations on race and how does institutional racism impact not just African Americans, but how it's also impacting you all as white students. I think that's the question that we have to ask today. So white students and non-black students will also lack the skill to engage and interact with the changing culture climate in America and abroad. Joe Fagan mentioned that racism involves substantial material, moral, and psychological costs to whites. The disassociation among racial groups will continue and cause suffering to the development of education and widening the economic gap in the workforce among African Americans and whites if we continue to allow this to exist. Thank you.